In the year 1177 BC, a scribe at the city of Ugarit, one of the wealthiest ports in the ancient world, pressed a message into wet clay that was never sent. The city was already burning. The tablet read, "The enemy ships came. They burned my cities. They burned my houses." Within weeks, Ugarit was ash. No one ever rebuilt it. And Ugarit wasn't alone. Across a span of roughly 50 years, 13 of the most powerful civilizations on Earth simply ceased to exist. The Mycenaeans, the Hittites, the Kassites of Babylon, the Cypriots, the Canaanites. Palace economies that had endured for centuries, gone. Trade networks stretching from Scandinavia to sub-Saharan Africa, severed. And Egypt, the mightiest empire of the age, barely survived and never fully recovered. No single war explains it. No single drought. No single earthquake. What happened in the eastern Mediterranean between roughly 1200 and 1150 BC remains the greatest systems collapse in human history. And the deeper you go into the record, the less certain the answers become. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what existed. By 1200 BC, the Bronze Age world was something remarkable, perhaps the first genuine globalized economy. Egyptian pharaohs exchanged letters with Hittite kings as diplomatic equals. Merchants from the Aegean carried copper ingots from Cyprus to the Nile Delta. Tin came from as far as Afghanistan. Amber arrived from the Baltic. Purple dye from Phoenician ports. The palace systems at Mycenae, at Hattusa, at Ugarit, they didn't just rule their own regions. They were nodes in an interconnected web that had been building for 300 years. And then, within 2 generations, it collapsed. The palaces burned. The writing systems vanished, Linear B, the Hittite script, the administrative records that held these economies together. The population of Greece fell by an estimated 75%. Some cities weren't just abandoned. They were never mentioned again. But here's where the official story starts to fall apart. For most of the 20th century, historians had a simple explanation: the Sea Peoples did it. Egyptian records, carved into the walls of Medinet Habu by Ramesses III, describe great waves of migrants and warriors arriving by land and sea, destroying everything in their path. No land could stand before their arms, the inscription reads. The Hittites, Ugarit, Cyprus, all attributed to this mysterious confederation. It was a clean answer. Invasion. Destruction. Collapse. The problem is that it doesn't hold. Modern archaeology has complicated the Sea Peoples narrative considerably. Yes, there were migrations. Yes, there were raids. But the destruction layers at collapsed sites don't always match an invasion pattern. Some cities show signs of fire but no weapons, no bodies, no arrowheads embedded in walls. Some were simply abandoned. And the Sea Peoples themselves, whoever they were, seem to have been refugees as much as invaders. Running from something. Not just causing chaos. Fleeing it. Which raises the question no one has satisfactorily answered: what were they running from? In the records I've kept across years of studying this period, 3 converging theories emerge, and none of them, alone, is sufficient. The first is climate collapse. Paleoclimatologist Brandon Drake published research in 2012 showing that the eastern Mediterranean experienced a prolonged drought beginning around 1200 BC, confirmed by pollen samples, isotope analysis, and sediment cores from the Sea of Galilee. Harvests failed. Grain shipment stopped. Hittite records from just before the collapse include desperate letters to Egypt begging for food, it is a matter of life and death, *1 reads. Famine weakens empires. It drives populations to move. It breaks the social contracts that hold palace economies together. But drought alone doesn't explain burned palaces. The second theory is seismic activity. Archaeologist Amos spent decades documenting earthquake destruction layers across the eastern Mediterranean, and the evidence is striking. Mycenaeans, Tiryns, Ugarit, Megiddo. Multiple sites show destruction consistent with major earthquakes occurring in rapid succession, what Ner called an earthquake storm, a cascade of seismic events triggered along fault lines. Earthquakes destroy infrastructure, kill populations, contaminate water supplies, and shatter the confidence of populations in their rulers and gods. But earthquakes don't explain the letters. The burning fleets. The desperate migrations across the sea. This is where the picture becomes genuinely unsettling. The third theory, and the one that historian Eric Klein has argued most persuasively in his landmark work, is that it wasn't any single cause. It was the complexity itself. The Bronze Age world was so deeply interconnected, so dependent on long supply chains for tin, copper, grain, and timber, that when multiple stresses hit simultaneously, drought, earthquakes, internal rebellions, disrupted trade, the entire system became brittle. One failure triggered another. A famine in one region created refugees. Refugees destabilized neighboring kingdoms. Destabilized kingdoms stopped paying mercenaries. Unpaid mercenaries raided. Raiders disrupted the copper routes. Without copper, you couldn't make bronze. Without bronze, your army collapsed. The civilization didn't fall to an enemy. It fell to itself. To its own interconnection. And here is the detail that stays with me most: the last letters from Ugarit, found in a kill where they were being fired when the city was destroyed, were requests for military help sent to Cyprus and the Hittites. Neither could respond. Both were already falling. No one came. Because there was no one left to come. What emerged from the wreckage took 400 years to rebuild. The Greek Dark Ages. Population scattered. Writing forgotten. Trade collapsed to subsistence level. When Homer eventually recorded the legends of Mycenae, he was describing a world so distant it had become mythology. And yet, a few things survived. The Phoenicians continued. The Assyrians, on the eastern edge of the collapse zone, weathered it and eventually expanded into the vacuum. The alphabet, a simplified writing system that required no palace scribes, spread precisely because the palace systems had died. In a strange way, the collapse democratized knowledge. The complexity that killed the Bronze Age gave way to something leaner, harder, more resilient. But 13 civilizations paid the price for that lesson. Few who have studied this period closely come away without a particular unease, not just historical, but contemporary. The Bronze Age world was not primitive. It was sophisticated, interconnected, and prosperous. Its administrators tracked grain shipments across thousands of miles. Its diplomats negotiated international treaties. Its merchants operated on systems of credit and contract. And it vanished in 50 years. What I find in the archives, again and again, is not evidence of a single catastrophe that could have been prevented. It's evidence of a world that became too dependent on everything going right, all at once, indefinitely. The scribe at Ugarit pressed his message into clay expecting help to arrive. It didn't. The city burned. The tablet survived, undelivered, unfired, waiting 3,000 years in the ash to be read. Perhaps the most important message from the Bronze Age collapse is not what destroyed it. It's that no one inside it saw the collapse coming until the ships were already in the harbor. If this is the kind of record you want to keep reading, subscribe to Lost Epochs. The next file is already open.